Our annual meeting attracted over 200 guests from local philanthropic, non-for-profit, and business community, one of our highest turnouts ever. It has been our tradition to feature a keynote speaker with the talent to inspire others and learn to take action. In 2013, our keynote speaker was Christine Reeves, who was a senior field associate from the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, and is a well-known organization that raises the bar in effective, responsive philanthropy that serves the greater good. Christine spoke about the importance of foundation grants to general operating support, to multi-year funding, to benefit the underserved community, and for social justice strategies.
So the topic I'm going to discuss today is navigating the philanthropic landscape, Ohio and nationwide. And so what is NCRP? And I really like using this visual because we really hold up a mirror to our philanthropic sector as a watchdog organization in philanthropy. So there's many groups, Philanthropy Ohio that convenes all Ohio-based grant makers in health that convenes all health grant makers. But we are a watchdog group that looks over the entire sector. We celebrate excellence, and we also see how is philanthropy able to challenge itself to do more and to do better, to be a laboratory, and also to be an instrument of social change that can do as much good as possible. So I have 3 numbers for you, if you're able to see them. And if we have any savants in the room, I'd love to know if anyone can think about what these 3 numbers might have in common. $3 billion. $45 billion, and $58 billion. So $3 billion is how much the Gates Foundation gives away every year. $45 billion is how much the entire philanthropic sector gives away every year. And $58 billion is how much the state of California's education budget distributes every year. So meditate on that for a moment. So when I work with funders that say, we're not Gates, we're not Ford, we're not Open Society, we're only giving away $1 million or even less than that. You have more in common with Gates than they do with one state's education budget. So to think about that when we were doing our work and how far dollars can go as being really important. And one of the things that I also like to mention is there's an old adage of babies in the river. Has anyone ever heard of that? Where people are picnicking on the river and babies are coming down and people are so startled they start jumping in to rescue these drowning babies, which makes complete sense. And then someone says, all right, half of you stay here, the rest of us, let's go to the top of the mountain, stop whoever's throwing them in. So that idea of where on the stream are you working? And it's not one or the other, but in the same way that we might diversify our investment portfolios, we wouldn't invest in just one company. How about investing our strategies that we're using in philanthropy? So direct service would be one strategy, distributing food, shelter, clothing, basic needs. But what other strategies could we involve? And that's what we'll be talking about today. So right now, there are about 90,000 gun-related deaths in the United States every year. Right now, we're facing extreme climate change problems that have been unparalleled. Right now, 600,000 individuals are homeless on any given day in the United States. That's roughly equivalent to an entire congressional district. And 1 in 5 children are food insecure. Right now, in the United States of America, on our watch. These are enormous problems, and just going through those numbers just now, how are we possibly able to address these? And, this isn't heaven. We're in a flawed environment with huge problems, but at the same time, what kind of innovations can we use? What ideas can we have? And what might be stopping us from pursuing some more? So philanthropy is an amazing opportunity to look at that. And now for some levity. I like golden retrievers. So thinking about some power dynamics, and I wanted to throw just a couple more numbers at you, and then I promise I'll hold back for a moment. 74,000 nonprofits in the country right now. And we have roughly 74,000 nonprofits, 1.9 million funders. What if that was the scenario? Because right now it's reversed. Okay? There's obviously many more nonprofits than there are funders. So what would a world look like if it was switched, just to play a bit of a mind game, just a thought exercise? And I think that that would be really telling. Would we be having nonprofits do site visits of funder offices? Would there ever be single year giving? Wouldn't it always be multiple year? Would there be program specific support or general operating support? So think about that just for some levity, but it's helpful for funders, I think, to put themselves in that perspective. It's the golden rule. It's in all religions for the most part. What if the shoe was on the other foot? And it's so easy. We see it in little kids all the time, and I see it in my own internal monologue sometimes. That's not fair. How often do we say that when someone has more than us? But how often do we say it when we have more than someone else? That's not fair. Please take my power away, please. It's rather unusual. And there's a lot of links that I see between philanthropy and our day-to-day work. I see a lot of links of lessons that we're seeing that we have growing up, that I have in my church, that I have with my friends, that can definitely apply. So think about that in your own life. All right. So now for the data. So metrics are important, but there's a trend right now that I'm seeing. I don't know if all of you are, but I feel like to a certain degree, philanthropy is trying to become the new math. Does anyone feel that way? There's so many reports and there's all these different tools and indexes, and some of them are great and incredibly helpful. And again, it's all in the eye of the beholder. But sometimes there's sort of a data fatigue in how are we measuring something, and how can it be in quarterly profit margins type perspectives when so many people are coming at this from the business community. When we're looking at some of those problems I just mentioned, we have to do things immediately and quickly and well. But at the same time, how do we have patience? And what happens when we're picking funding opportunities that are easily measured versus picking ones that are needed but not necessarily easily measured, and instead we try to find creative ways to measure them. So it's sort of a chicken or the egg, but it's a good challenge. So the first main metric that I'm going to bring up, here we go, is general operating support. So has anyone heard of general operating support? Maybe a couple people. So it's an idea that instead of funding a particular program, let's say you're working on homelessness. So you could have a program that's going to go towards a particular shelter. General operating support is the concept that that's great, but why aren't we trusting nonprofits to receive a grant, but also maybe pay for rent or a copy machine, phone bills, other things that are necessary. And so it's a bit of a trust mentality. And one of the things I like to bring up is pretend you're a shareholder in a Fortune 500 company. I assume some of you might be. And you are writing a check to AT&T. And AT&T is a communications expert. But you wrote your check and said, I want it to only go towards certain keypads on certain cell phones. Best of luck. And you would be there and you'd go to different meetings and help them out, but you wouldn't necessarily be trusting them. And like I said earlier, to give away power is a difficult thing, especially when you have the best intentions in mind. So this is something we work with foundations. I was in Chicago recently, and a funder there was telling me that the reason why they started funding general operating support was that they thought it was like ordering a cappuccino but only paying for the foam if you do program-specific support. And again, we're not saying you have to do 100% of it, but it's a strategy that you can weave into grant making. And it's also a conversation that nonprofits are often startled to bring up with their funders, because it's a delicate balance and you want to nurture the relationship. So these are some just conversation starters to have. At NCRP, we recommend that 50% of a funder's work go to general operating support. And again, different for every foundation. Some might argue that that's arbitrary, but it's just a good starting point. So here's some nationwide data. NCRP every year puts out fact sheets on the state of these 4 principles, and one of them is general operating support. So currently, 24% is the share of grant-making dollars that's going towards general operating support. But that's the rosier picture. If we're looking at the median, 7% is the median foundation share of general operating support, meaning 93%, median-wise, would be going towards program-specific support. And that is difficult for a lot of executive directors and development directors, assuming there even is a development director on staff. So this is a really good conversation for funders and grantees to have together and really see themselves as partners at the table, even though one has more funding and one has the ability to carry funding out. I was actually at a conference recently, and there was a young program officer who asked a question of how do we help nonprofits be less dependent on us? How do we wean off nonprofits so they can be self-sustaining? And I looked at him very earnestly and I said, well, unless you're an operating foundation, which does your own programming, aren't funders dependent on nonprofits? Because you have to get 5% of your money out the door every year. You got to give it to somebody. And he laughed, and it was a good discussion of how many assumptions can we kind of turn on their head. And again, catch more bees with honey, but just to have a discussion that can be frank and open. So here is where Ohio is. So the bar on the left, the dark blue, is Ohio. You guys are actually exceeding the national average in general operating support at 30% of shares of grants and 24% being the national average. Second one is multiple year support. Anyone heard of multiple year support? So multiple year support is the idea of more than 1 year of grant making. And this is really helpful because when you're looking at stopping gun-related violence, of achieving 100% literacy, of ending homelessness, all by 2020, I see a lot of these really visionary mission statements that are exciting, lofty, and rather audacious and hairy and scary. So if we're looking at that as our goal, how are we able to do it with 1 year of grant proposals? That is challenging, okay? And I know this is revolutionary. A lot of you have never thought about this before. But to be able to have the grace of 2 years or more to put together a project is helpful. You might need to be buying a building. You might need to invest in more employees. You might have turnover. Things might not go according to plan. And so this is a helpful conversation. So the idea of having more time is something that's a key ingredient. And human resources are really all a nonprofit organization has on the funder or the nonprofit side. We don't have a product per se. So how do we invest in that, in people? And even if we're not achieving that 100% literacy by 2020, what if we also thought that part of our funder goals would be to champion the mission, not only of our own, but the missions of our grantees? And I challenge funders to memorize their grantees' mission statements and put themselves in the business of being there for them. Again, I mentioned I have like a theater background. So in an article I recently wrote about being a generalist or specialist in philanthropy, I thought, what kind of funders do we have? Do we have the ones center stage taking bows? Do we have the ones in the front row cheering? Do we have the anonymous donor? Or do we have the funders that are in the wings waiting to be called upon if something needs to happen? How can I help? Let me know. Here's my phone number. And of course, there's a lot of different combinations of all of those. Everyone has a different scenario, but multiple year funding can be a big step in that direction. And again, NCRP looks for a hope of half of funding being multiple year support, just as an idea, so that it doesn't cause stress on the nonprofit side. So let's see where the country is. So for those who can't see, over our last 3 fact sheets, we were at 16% in holding from 2004 to 2010, and it currently dropped to 14% of multiple year support as a share. However, when you add in the Gates Foundation, it jumps to 29%. So I wanted to show that differential because it shows how, the colossus in the room, we can't really ignore it. But it looks like we're doing a lot better than we are. And if I was talking with the Gates Foundation, it would be a different presentation, but to look at really what the number is when we subtract them from the equation, which is just 14%. And it might be a good conversation for funders and grantees to have together about this. And again, not wanting to be a downer, but it looks even worse when you see it as this statistic, which I didn't put up there, but 89% of funders give 0 multiple year support. So this 14% is by the 11% of funders who do. So thinking about that as a conversation, thinking about that as a motivator, a lot of funders just think, it's, again, the best intentions. I work with fantastic funders, and I feel like, again, comfort the afflicted, afflict the comfortable, and I'm poking them with a really soft stick, I promise. But this idea that when you include multiple year support, it's in people's best interest. Okay. Third, underserved communities. So our last two get a little more in depth. Underserved communities is a concept that NCRP uses a lot, and the next one we're going to talk about is social justice. And we actually have an initiative called Philanthropy's Promise, which I'll mention at the end, which includes both of these concepts. A lot of people are doing this without necessarily doing it intentionally or using NCRP's vocabulary. And we're not saying that you need to use NCRP's vocabulary at all, which I'll get to, but rather to think about doing what you're already doing, but to make it a little more intentional. And the goal of that is to make things a little less taboo and also open up more transparent dialogue in the sector, especially as new foundations form every day. I don't know if anyone's heard of the Margaret A. Cargill Foundation that's forming in Minnesota, Cargill Industries Agriculture. Margaret passed away, and unbeknownst, since it was a private company, it will now be the second or third largest foundation in the country with $8 billion in assets. And their current 2 board members are trying to put together this massive mission statement and strategic plan, and some of these resources are helpful to them, all because they're getting out into the ether and people are having more conversations. So, underserved communities. Okay. I like philanthropic theory and public policy theory. I am a nerd. I understand that not everyone here is, so I'm going to try not to delve too deeply into some of this jargon. But there's a phrase that I really think is important, and that's called targeted universalism. And it's an idea that if you're going to look at, let's say, the city of Cleveland, that is your backdrop, and you want to have the really important goal of helping everyone equally in the entire city. That is a tremendously important and thoughtful concern. But when we do that, when we want to help everyone equally, it can often exacerbate existing disparities, because people who have the most affluence and access often know how to benefit most from something, whereas people who are least likely to receive the benefits are least likely to actually receive them. So NCRP tracks 11 different underserved, sometimes called marginalized, communities. And the reason why we track these 11 is because these are the 11 we got the Foundation Center to track, an organization that pools all 990s from foundations. So for instance, rural isn't on here, rural communities. I definitely consider that to be an underserved one, but we just don't have data on it. So whatever ones you're looking at, whatever communities you're working in as a nonprofit or a funder, think about how targeted you might be to that community. Because the more targeted that you are, the more likely those people are able to receive benefits. And not just as a recipient, not just as a have-not receiving something from a have, but as someone who's empowered and at the decision-making table, or being thought of and consulted in that process. So this is another helpful visual. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's been going around the internet a lot. So 3 people, 3 kids, 3 different heights. And the idea of untargeted universalism would be everyone getting the same amount of help, stepping stool. Whereas targeted universalism would be giving the shortest person the most boxes to stand on, and so that people are indeed the same height. So again, looking at the Gates Foundation showing 33%, 40%, and 42%, but without Gates, 29%, 31%, and holding at 31% from 2004 to 2011. And this is something that we think can definitely improve. 24% is the median foundation giving to an underserved community. So an example might be wanting to do an education program to help all kids versus looking specifically how girls react differently from boys and doing the same program that is designed maybe by women for women isn't necessarily going to help the boys in that school. And that's not discrimination, it's just able to target people differently. A lot of funders in different communities I'm working with are doing assessments to see where are there gaps and are we trying to fill them, or are we trying to look at what we're actually doing as a niche goal and delving as deeply as possible into that without looking at other areas just because of limited time and resources is two different approaches. So inch thick, mile wide, or mile thick, inch wide. Another thing to keep in mind is I'm in Washington, D.C., and right now, roughly, because of my friends on the Hill and the different political avenues that they pursue, right now, lobbyists in DC, only 5% claim to represent an underserved community. So what NCRP is saying that it might be systemic change that we need to look at, even though we have the best intentions to put Band-Aids on broken legs. How do we do that? Who do we talk to about it? So again, not wanting the perfect to be the enemy of the good, NCRP has a definition for social justice, but the main idea of it is that we're looking at a system change of bottom up and those who are most affected by problems having a say in the solution, as opposed to haves giving to have-nots based on what haves see as the problem, the solution, and the prioritization of solving the problem. So that's just one approach. I guarantee if you ask 100 people, you'll have 100 different definitions. But is that an approach that you use? Is that an approach you might want to think about using? And there's a lot of steps in between to get there. So again, just looking at what are definitions, what are examples. And NCRP has a report called Leveraging Limited Dollars. We did 7 reports on different geographic areas over a 3-year period, looking at a total of 110 nonprofits and 326 funders who funded them. And we found that when those funders and nonprofits each focused on a specific underserved or marginalized community and used some form of a social justice strategy, which can include but doesn't have to be limited to advocacy, community organizing, grassroots work, civic engagement, voter registration, civic leadership, it's sometimes called. For every $1 these funders invested, there was a $115 return in a 3-year period. An example would be in Portland, there was an organization called the Partnership for Safety and Justice with a firepower executive director that works on prison recidivism. This is not an easy area to get funding for. It's not babies, it's not endangered cute panda bears. It's challenging to get funders to fund prison reform and recidivism issues. But he put together this incredible coalition that included self-help, direct service, education, advocacy, organizing, civic engagement, just the works, all braided together. And he ended up over a 3-year period through a coalition saving the state of Oregon almost $2 billion because a prison that was on slate to be built was no longer needed because there wasn't enough crime. That doesn't even begin to account for the quantitative benefits of having 2 parents who aren't in prison, of less cops on the street, of property values going up because there isn't crime. So examples of how social justice can save taxpayer dollars. And another thing to think about sometimes is it's often seen as political, Democrat, Republican, and something that I might offer is it's political either way. And it can either be nonpartisan, which would be my choice, or you can be non-present because it's happening. And you can either advocate for positive systemic change or for the status quo. There's no way to not advocate for something. So just to think about what you're doing. Another thing to consider is anytime you're working with kids, you're advocating for them since they can't represent themselves. Whereas community organizing would be an approach where helping people represent themselves without you, so they no longer need an advocate. So how is it that we can remember that these problems have faces and names and stories. And although we're so motivated by measurement, how can we also be measured by the qualitative and qualitative work?
Our work at the Community West Foundation has been recognized both locally and nationally. It's especially gratifying to have our work endorsed by the National Association for Responsive Philanthropy, which awarded Community West its highest honor, Inclusion in Philanthropy's Promise. There are over 108,000 foundations in the USA. However, only a select group, 170 foundations, have received this honor for providing general operating support, multi-year funding, and grants that benefit underserved communities and social justice initiatives. Philanthropy's Promise celebrates the country's most innovative and influential grant-making institutions, such as the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson, the Kellogg Foundation, and now Community West Foundation. All seek to maximize the effectiveness of their grants and generate the greatest impact possible. The ability to respond to needs in our community is one of our strengths. Did you know that 90% of our grant making is to agencies that support and meet the needs of the marginalized communities? The other 10% of our grant making is devoted to direct advocacy, particularly for those affected by mental health issues. It's tremendously rewarding to be recognized for our worthwhile work that we do at Community West Foundation in our commitment to social justice and our willingness to support the most challenging needs for some of the most vulnerable in our community.
Philanthropy represents the best spirit of our society, improving the lives of citizens and communities. In the last 10 years alone, American foundations have provided $381 billion in grants. Today's philanthropy is informed by the era begun at the dawn of the 20th century. A new generation of philanthropists built lasting institutions. As America evolved, philanthropy grew with it. The National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy was formed in 1976 to bring the voices of nonprofit organizations and underserved communities into the conversation. We nudged the sector toward more openness. Today, we help the giving community reimagine how to contribute to lasting change. Grantmakers come in all shapes and sizes, and they all want to maximize the impact of their dollars. They want to make a difference. But their resources are small compared to the enormity and complexity of the challenges we face today. For example, people in 29 countries live longer than Americans while spending far less on health care. And here's an ugly fact. A white baby born in the nation's capital can expect to live 83 years today, while an African American baby lives just 71 because of social disadvantages. We are launching Philanthropy's Promise to help all grant makers take advantage of the latest research that will help them be smarter and more strategic with their grant dollars. The Philanthropy's Promise campaign is about effective philanthropy. It celebrates grant makers that make reaching underserved communities their priority. After all, a rising tide can't lift all boats if some boats have holes. Effective philanthropy also means foundations promoting policy solutions, not just services. Grants that fix the systems that perpetuate failure move us toward equal opportunity. Here's a success. A Baltimore nonprofit led a coalition that passed a living wage, which spawned hundreds of similar laws across the country. Philanthropy helped make this possible. Their grants led to more than $6.5 billion in additional wages annually, helping people in poverty make ends meet. When foundations focus on reaching those in need with solutions like these, society wins. Sign on to Philanthropy's Promise. Help lead the way into a future where everyone benefits.